Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is an expression that means carpe diem. It's all about going after what you want in life. And something that I wanted to do this year was to rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time talk about it with real life humans. And I'm up leveling that now because I'm getting a chance to talk with people who actually worked on this show. And so this is going to be another one of these really cool interviews where we get to hear what people who worked on the show have to say about it. Before I introduce my guest, a quick housekeeping item. If you are brand new to the show Halt and Catch Fire, the interviews are spoiler filled. Okay, so we could talk about anything from any episode of the show at any point. If you want spoiler-free content, go check out my episode recaps. They're safe up until the episode that you're on. But having said all that, I am very excited to introduce my guest for today, who is Carl Ledbetter, who was the technical consultant on all 4 seasons of the show. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you, Melissa. Good to be here. This is a great show, and the opportunity to talk about it is a lot of fun.
I'm so glad. I mean, first of all, with your role in particular, I'd love to hear about your background. What expertise did you have that you brought in with you to this role of technical consultant to Halt and Catch Fire?
Well, I was a part of the industry during all of the period that the show covers from the very beginning. In fact, during the time period of the very first year of the show, which started in 82, 83, around there, I was at IBM. In fact, I was at IBM for 6 years. I was not in the PC division, so I have the advantage of having seen everything up close, but from just far enough that I have a little bit of perspective on it. But prior to being in that job at IBM, I had built my own computer using a CPM S100 bus-based system. So I'd soldered it all together and made my own flip-flops and so forth. So I knew how the computers work. So I knew how all the pieces of the story had all come together, and I had done almost all of them, although I was not doing it in the PC division at IBM when I was there. I was doing it in the large machine division at the time. But my background is I have a PhD in mathematics, and I've been playing with computers since I touched my first one in 1967. So it's been a really interesting run. And then as my career went on, all of the other things that happened in the later years of the show, seasons 2, 3, and 4, I was part of some business that was in the middle of each one of those revolutions. By the time you get around to season 2 and 3, I was in 2 and 3 and 4, I was in the Sun Microsystems, which was part of the PC networking business, and the whole online stuff and all the things that were involved with networking. And so I was someplace where I could see all of the things that are of the kind that are happening in all 4 seasons of the show.
I think as this conversation goes on, people will see just like how deep your knowledge is in all of these areas. So I think knowing what your background is lends a lot to the conversation. Having said all of that, how and when did you get connected to this show to work on it?
I got a call from one of the Chris's, and I can't even remember today whether it was Chris Rogers or Chris Cantwell. They were working on the show, as you know, and it was their very first script, really. And they were looking for somebody to make sure they didn't make a terrible technical error of some kind and say something that was laughable, which very frequently happens in any kind of a technology show, particularly in dealing with computers. And so somebody, and I don't know who, had suggested that they give me a call, and they did, and we hit it off very well and started working together. I met both Chris's in that first week, and then Melissa Berenstein, who was the producer and on the show, and almost immediately got involved with them. And the very first thing I did is I started reading their script. So the very first thing I worked on was the pilot script. And before it was over, I read and edited every single script of every single season, although some of them were much more heavily edited than others, depending on what was going on the show at the time. And I was editing for the technology pieces, of course, not the rest of the drama, which is part of what makes all of this hang together. And we'll get around how the drama revolved around several things that came out of complicated mashups of real people in the industry, many of whom I talked to the writers about in the early episodes. So after that, I went out and spent 2 days with the two Chris's and Jonathan Lisco, who is the showrunner, and he'd hired a bunch of writers, and I guess they'd gotten the green light on the project. So this was a few months later, and I spent 2 full days, about 8 hours a day, sitting in a large conference room with all the writers around the table, and they were asking questions, and I was telling stories, and I was telling stories of things that actually happened in the computer industry over the time, and it was a very interesting, meandering conversation that covered all kinds of aspects of it. And then I watched the miracle that the writers performed in taking bits and pieces of each one of those little stories and putting them in slightly different contexts to mash them up and base characters and scenes and episodes on those events that actually happened. Anybody who came out of that industry at that time recognizes where a lot of those little scenes and episodes came from. And I get calls constantly when somebody, during the time the show was first on, but then as people find the show again, it has gotten a real cult following because technology people love it, because it's unlike most technology shows on TV. This one doesn't make any big technology mistakes, so they love it. And they say, oh, that thing that happened in episode 6, I know that must have come from you, and you were talking about so-and-so at IBM or somebody at Microsoft or somebody in the industry. And so it was really quite kind of interesting to see the way the writers turned real things in slightly different contexts, put them into different people's mouths and twisted the characters around. And so all the episodes are based on something that really happened in the industry. And it was a lot of fun to do that.
So would you have had that conversation before you started seeing the scripts for the show, where you sat down and told them stories, or was it sort of partway in?
At the time that I had those long conversations, the first 2 days of them, there were more than that, but the first 2 days were the longest. I had read only the pilot script and had edited it pretty heavily to make sure that the thing that they were doing, they were getting right. And remember the way the show started out, it was how people reverse engineered the IBM PC with the BIOS and made it run. And they had written something up and they had some things in there, but it wasn't right. It wasn't the way it would have happened. And so they asked me to explain to them how it would have happened. And I basically wrote all the little chunks. Now they fitted it together with dialogue and everything else, but I wrote large parts of some of those early scripts, at least the rough draft of them, so that they would get the technology right. And then they lifted the phrases that they wanted out of the script so that the phrases are correct. And that's part of what registers so well with technology people, is that it doesn't sound like somebody who didn't know what they were doing, write it up. In fact, I'm on the board of directors of a public company, Cloudflare, and the chief technology officer of Cloudflare is John Graham Cumming, who's sort of a hero in the tech community in real life, because he's the person who mounted the campaign a few years ago to get Alan Turing pardoned for the conviction that he got for being homosexual. And it was a dreadful episode in computer history, and John led that campaign. But John has other roles as well, including the one that I know him in professionally. But he also runs a website. And the website is a website that mocks technology shows and movies on TV by showing the stuff that's running on the screen doesn't do what it is that they say in the script it's doing. And when I got engaged with Chris Rogers and Chris Cantwell and Jonathan Lisco and the writers on this show, I wanted to make sure that I didn't appear on John Graham Cumming's website as somebody who had screwed up what was actually on the computer screen or how something actually worked. And I was very pleased with the fact that John Graham Cumming actually told me afterwards that the reason people love is that it doesn't have any of those. And I regarded that as my responsibility to make sure that the technology that's in the show that you can see actually works the way it says it works. So all the code that you actually see on the screen, there's not very much of it, but there are a few times when you actually see script running. I wrote all of that to make sure that it would look right for the time and actually accomplish the purpose that they said it did in the show. The most interesting episode of that kind is in, I think it was the first or second show. They were probing the BIOS chip, and they wanted to reproduce it. So they wanted to find out what it said. And when they did it, they were reading out hexadecimal characters, which gives you it's the way binary arithmetic is encoded for engineers. Instead of looking at a strings of zeros and ones, you group them together in groups of 4. And so every one of those groups of 4 binary digits gets a digit, and the digits are 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 9, but then it goes A, B, C, D, and F, because you have to have 16 of them to make it work. And so every one of them, you read the bytes off the thing by saying 0, F, 2, B. And in one of the scenes in the show, they were reading the hexadecimal character. And I realized as I was looking at the screen that they were reading it wrong. They were saying an F instead of a D, but it turns out that, a B instead of a D. It's the difference between this. That's a one of those is a B and one of those is a D. And when you turn it upside down, they reverse. And the camera shot the scene from the other side of the table. So what they were reading was correct, and that was the dialogue. What the viewer saw was an upside down B, so that it was a D. And so it was actually correct. And that was a time when John Graham Cummings saved me, because he pointed out that I didn't make a mistake, that the camera was on the other side of the table.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. I'm especially interested in these early conversations that you had with the Chris's, where you told all these stories, because we're going to, as you referenced, we're going to see that this show starts with PCs, but then takes on a lot of other developments over a period of, more than a decade of the show.
Yeah, that's about right.
How many of those different things were brought up in those early conversations, or did you stay focused on PCs? Because I don't know how far they were thinking in terms of where the scripts would go in seasons 2 and beyond.
I don't know how far they were thinking at the time we did the first set of interviews. There was another set of interviews near the end of the first season or in the beginning of the second season, and that went much further. But when I was telling the stories, what they were looking for, I think, in fact, they said as much, was character development things. They wanted to know things they could use in the show. So I wasn't talking exclusively about PCs. First of all, I didn't work on PCs during that whole period. I was using a PC during that whole time, obviously, but there were people in the industry that were part of the mashups that they did that didn't have anything to do with PCs. The character played by Toby Huss was based on a very senior IBM executive who was never involved in the PC business. He was a mainframe guy. His name was Jack Bertram, and he was called Black Jack Bertram because he was a pretty tough character, and that was the character that Toby played in the show. The scene where Gordon Clark digs the gigantic hole outside of his house is based on the fact that the very famous supercomputer designer Seymour Cray, who worked for Cray Research and had the fastest machine in the world at about the era that the show was covering at the time, he used to go out in his yard and dig it was in Minnesota, and he would dig these gigantic tunnels under the snow around his house and underneath his house. So the writers were picking up incidents and vignettes and scenes that they could use in this context, even if they were from other parts of the computer industry or based on people who were in other parts of the industry. But we also touched on things that were near the end of the show's arc, because the PC was actually launched by IBM in August of '81. And Compaq Computer and several other smaller companies had started cloning it in '82 and '83, I think is when Compaq shipped their machine. And Compaq is really what Cardiff Electric is based on. That was the company that was the closest direct analog of Cardiff Electric. And so we know they fitted all the pieces together around all those things. But by the time the show got to the end, the web was there. The World Wide Web was launched in 91, so near the end of the arc of the show. It came out of CERN, the physics consortium at CERN. And so I was involved in that from when I was at IBM and later with the people who developed the World Wide Web. So all of those pieces were part of those early conversations and telling about the behavior, the idiosyncrasies of some of the interesting characters in the computer business. And of course, the main characters of the show are mashups of people who really existed. It's not an accident that Gordon Clark and his wife Donna Clark are similar sounding names to Gary Kildall and Dorothy Kildall, who are the characters on whom they are mostly based. And they are the characters who essentially invented what became MS-DOS, Microsoft DOS, because Bill Gates basically scooped them on getting the contract with IBM, but Gary and Dorothy were the ones who always just missed, just like Gordon and Donna had just missed, and that's part of the background of the show. And even near the very end of the show, where Scoop McNairy's character Gordon Clark dies, Gary Kildall died much too young, in his 50s, under very unusual circumstances, not of a disease, but he was probably murdered is what it looks like, and nobody knows for sure. But so there were all those little pieces that were part of the stories that the writers picked up and then reconfigured to build an interesting storyline. And of course, the sort of piece de resistance, the Cameron character, Cameron Howe, played brilliantly by Mackenzie Davis, was essentially a modern version of Ada Lovelace, who was the assistant for George Babbage, who is usually credited as being the first person who wrote a computer algorithm back in the 1800s for the Babbage computing engine, a mechanical computing engine. But in the 1980s, not all that different from the time when the show is set, a bunch of old records were recovered in the UK that showed that it was Ada Lovelace who had actually figured out what we now call an algorithm and had invented the notion of what a computer program would look like. And so in her honor, the computer language Ada was named for her. And Cameron Howe's character is based on Ada Lovelace. And you can see some other very interesting little Easter eggs from this. If you look at some of the pan shots at the beginning of, forget which seasons they were in, but that are looking at Cameron's apartment before she moved into the trailer later, you can see a picture of Ada Lovelace on the wall, and underneath it is a copy of Byron's poetry. And that's a deep Easter egg, because there are very few people who actually know that Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter, someone that he saw only once in her whole life when she was a little baby, and then he never saw her again. So that little connection is not very well known. And the writers picked it up, and it basically got buried in the show in lots of the pan shots. And anybody who knows that story picked it up immediately and was all excited about it.
Wow. Well, so you've sort of touched on almost all of the main characters in terms of who they were inspired by, except for Joe. So where did Joe come from?
Well, Joe is more complicated. I don't think Joe is as a direct connection to any single individual. He's more a mashup of lots of individuals who were there, but there are certainly people like Joe McMillan all over the computer industry at the time. All of the IBM sales side behaved very much like the way Joe McMillan did. I don't know that you could say that he was a dead ringer for any particular character. In some ways, I think some of the mannerisms and behavior of Joe McMillan that the writers picked up came out of stories that I told them about meetings and times I had had with Steve Jobs. So that might be the closest, but Jobs wasn't actually an IBM salesperson, but there was a sort of a personality fit with what Joe did. And even Carrie Bechet's character, Donna Clark, one of the very interesting things, I don't know that very many people notice it. Do you remember what job she was doing when the show started?
She was working with Texas Instruments.
Yes, that's very good. She worked with Texas Instruments. And so she was herself a technical person. But do you know why Texas Instruments?
No.
Texas Instruments is the company that patented the integrated circuit in 1956. And so IBM had patented the transistor, but it was Texas Instruments that patented the integrated circuit, which became the basis for all the chips we make in computing. So even that little connection, making her they could have made her an engineer for any company or even a fictitious one, but they made it Texas Instruments to pick up on the connection between the birth of the computer industry coming out of those patents.
I have follow-up questions and they're splitting off in more than one direction. So I'll make a call here. So let's talk about Donna a little bit more. There's a scene in season 1 where she's recovering data from a torched hard drive, and
correct.
The solve that she offers even impresses the other engineers at Cardiff Electric. So I'd love to know more about this scene, and are there other really technical scenes like this that the writers leaned heavily on you for?
Yes. In fact, they asked me whether that could be done, and I described to them a way that it might have worked. And I think that was the scene. I think Joe had blowtorched the hard disk. Is that right? If I remember right, it scorched the hard disk.
They had plugged in a vacuum cleaner to make it look like the power had surged and that it wiped out. Like Cam didn't have the backups properly stored, and they all got wiped out.
Yes, and what she's doing on the disk at the time they do it is in fact possible to do. It's extraordinarily tedious. It's very much like the early scene in the garage where they're trying to pull off the entire BIOS. The BIOS is 64 kilobits, which is 64,000 bits. So there are a lot of them, a lot of bits in there. So it's a long, tedious process. It would take hours to do it. And similarly, the scene where Carrie recovers the data off of a hard disk would have been extraordinarily tedious and long, but you could do it. And remember, we think about computer memories, disks, and we don't even have disks anymore. We have solid state memories. But back when we had disks, the disks were, and the CD drives they store gigabytes of information. Nowadays, terabytes of information, and terabytes are trillions of bits of information. You could never do it now. It would take too long. It would take centuries to pull off the disk. But in those days, those disks were not that big. Floppies were very small. Even the 3.5-inch diskettes were very small. I remember in those days, right around that time, in fact, Bill Gates said he wondered why anybody would ever need more than 64 kilobits. And nowadays, 1,000 times that is megabit, 1,000 times that is gigabits, and 1,000 times that is terabits. That means it's a billion times bigger than that is what we have today. So it wouldn't be possible today, but in 1982, it was possible. And she could have just pulled that off. You would have lost a handful of bits along the part where the head had crashed, or you'd gotten a burn mark on the disk or something. But good programmers with some time would be able to repair and figure out what had been in there and at least make it work. And so, it was just barely possible to do what she did.
One of the things that I'm intrigued about is the code. Well, as I've been doing this rewatch, as I get to scenes where they show us what's on a computer screen, I tend to look at what's there now more so. I'll freeze the frame. I'll read, if it's in season 2 and if it's a chat in a community forum, I'm reading that. I don't know how to read code, but I'm imagining that, like you said earlier, there was quite a lot of thought put into what does this all do. Are there any fun nuggets of information around some of what you put into the code that we should know in terms of what you were trying to make that code do?
Well, it was very constrained by what the dialogue said they were doing. So in every case, what I wanted to do is make sure that what was on the screen was something that would actually do, or at least be part of, a program that was doing what they said. There were times when I could find it, when I could actually go back into the archives and stuff that was now in the public domain, you could pull it out. And what most technology shows do is they go get something out of an old Microsoft manual or something, and they find some piece of code that they don't, since they don't program themselves, they don't know what it does, and they run it on the screen. But any computer programmer would look at it and say, well, that's not what that's doing. But what I did is I either got the code that they're describing from that era, or when I couldn't find something that was doing exactly what they said was happening on the screen, I wrote it using a programming language and in a style that would have been appropriate for the era. And those eras change from the 82, 83 part in the early years all the way out to what was happening in season 4. Those are very different things. They were using different computer languages even. So you had to have them written in languages that were correct for what they were doing. And that probably took me overall, although it was, several big chunks, half a dozen big chunks, that might have taken me more time than actually going through the scripts did, because it takes a long time to get the code right. I wanted to make sure that the code that you could see would actually have run and done what they were saying.
Well, you raise a really interesting point that, every language evolves, and we add to it. Words can change their meaning or duplicate in meaning, and it must have been the same thing for code at that time. So even if you had a proficiency in code, did you have it from every year that we were showing?
Yes.
Were there time periods that were harder for you versus ones that were more natural?
I program in probably 20 different computer languages, some better than others, of course, but none of them would have been difficult for me during that period. I started with what's called assembly language, which is the most basic language. In fact, I don't know if you've had anybody remark on it, but even the title of the show itself comes out of that era. Halt and Catch Fire came from a computer command that was HCF, which is a three-letter designator for a computer command, which evidence suggests started as a joke at IBM, because there's a thing called a race condition in computers where you get something that keeps going and it can't make itself stop. So it can in the early days, it could make a chip heat up, and that's where the catch fire part came. But it was a joke. But in a few years later, and right about the time or a little before the time of the show is set, it was the Motorola 6800 chip that actually had an instruction called HCF. And it started because of the joke, but it became an actual command in the assembly language of the Motorola 6800, which actually did something. It was part of a test condition that you would set when you were debugging the machine. So it's a real command. It wasn't used for anything important, but it's part of the folklore of the industry as it developed. And it shows that there were other companies like Motorola that were important in the industry, as well as IBM and Microsoft and their clones, Cardiff Electric, and
As you talk, I'm sure there were quite a lot of different technical principles that made their way into the show. And one thing that you had referenced with me earlier was, in season 1, in episode 5, Cameron's going to cite Brooks' Law and the Mythical Man Month.
Yep.
She basically lets go of a whole bunch of programmers, and she claims the job of her supervisor. And so there's, a lot of really interesting character and plot development happening there, but also it's based on a technical principle. Are there other ones that made their way into scripts? Which ones stick out for you?
Well, the two that I think are the most interesting that made it into the script are two of the most important in the industry. One of them is Brooks' Law, which you mentioned, and I'll say something about in a second. The other one is the Doherty threshold, which is based on a paper that was written by Walt Doherty and Arvind Tadani in about 1979. But back to Brooks' Law, for instance, Fred Brooks was one of the lead architects on the IBM 360 architecture, set a few years before this show started. But then he left IBM and became a professor of computer science at the University of North Carolina. And he wrote a marvelous book called The Mythical Man Month. And one of the principles in the Mythical Man Month is when a software project is late, adding programmers to it makes it later. And that was the principle that Cameron cites in the show. And it's also based on an episode that I actually witnessed firsthand at IBM with Jack Bertram, whom I mentioned earlier, on whom Toby Huss's character is based. Jack Bertram took over a very important, very large, very late software project at IBM. And he, unknown to anybody, including me at the time, was that he was already terminally ill. He had pancreatic cancer and he would die in about 9 months. And his boss, Jack Keeler, who was an IBM executive who later became president, knew this. And so he said, Jack, I have one more big assignment for you. You need to go get this MBSXA out on time for IBM. And what Jack Bertram did is, in his very first day on the job, he called a very big meeting with all the people in the building. And he said, all of you whose last names start with A to L, raise your hand. And people raised their hand. And he said, you guys are all on immediate 6-month sabbatical from IBM with pay. Please leave the building. And everybody laughed, but he was serious, and they all left. And then the rest of the people, the M to Z's, he said, okay, the rest of you, now we're going to finish MBSXA in less than 6 months. And Bertram knew, of course, that he only had about that long to live. And he was doing the Brooks Law principle that too many people on the project was slowing it down, too many meetings, too much interference, too many different ideas. He wanted to get it focused on one direction. So that's where that came from. And that's where Cameron's behavior came from. The other one plays also a very important role in the movie, and it's the Doherty threshold. Yeah. Walt Doherty and his co-author, Arvind Tadani, wrote a paper in 1979. Well, you can still find it online. It's actually frequently cited now because of the Halt and Catch Fire TV show. But it was a paper. I knew Walt Doherty extremely well. He was a brilliant guy. And he worked in the kind of odd space between technology and marketing. He was himself a technologist, but he was what the IBM sales people called customer ready. He was somebody that you could send out with customers and he wouldn't drool on his tie. He'd make a very good impression. And Walt was brilliant. And one of the things he had picked up was that the IBM salesman had a sort of a heuristic about when they could sell an upgrade to a computer or a new computer and the next computer up in IBM's line. And the heuristic was that when you typed in a command on the computer in those days, remember this is late 70s, and the machine didn't respond to you for something like 4 seconds, they got frustrated and they would complain about the performance of the computer. And then the IBM salesman knew they could go in and sell an upgrade to the company. And Walt Doherty wondered whether that was a real thing. So he studied it. And then he wanted, and it was true, and then he wanted to know why it was a real thing. And he came up with the notion of trying to figure out the economic value of how long you had to wait after you pushed the return button on a computer keyboard. And the paper is called The Economic Value of Rapid Response Time. And it would be hard for me to think of a more influential paper in the history of the computer industry, because it affects everything we do now. When you go to a website, you know your own behavior. When you push the button and the screen fills immediately, you're engaged. But if you have to wait for it to scroll down, you're not going to be as likely to buy something on the site, for instance. And there was a period of time where we made jokes that we, instead of www, we should have put a fourth W on there. It should have been www. It should have been waiting for the World Wide Web, because it was, everything was so slow. Well, Walt Doherty found a way to make that real. He said he studied the behavior of people and noticed that there were thresholds at which their behavior changed. There was one threshold that occurred at around somewhere between 12 and 20 seconds. If you pushed a button and it took longer than that, you could get up and leave your office or go do something else or make a phone call. Now, if it was any longer than that, it was like putting card boxes in to go into a hopper in the old days, and you come back after lunch. So it was a very different behavior. But then if you could get below 12 seconds, somewhere between 4 and 12 seconds, you didn't tend to leave the premises, but you might do something else. You might turn and work on a note or do an email or something else while you were waiting. And then below 4 seconds and down to 2 seconds, there was another kind of behavior, but below 2 seconds, something else happened. And below 4/10 of a second, you became really welded to the screen. It was almost like it was interactive. And what Walt Doherty was able to do by testing people who were doing word processing, believe it or not, that's the application he used to measure. He said, how productive are people doing word processing when the delay between when they type something in and push the enter button and it returns to them on the screen? And he was able to measure productivity and equate that to how many dollars it was worth to whoever was doing the word processing work. And because of that, he saw that those thresholds were, in fact, right where we expected them to be, right where the IBM salespeople had noticed, at about 4/10 of a second, at about 2, at about 4, about 12. And then beyond that, it was, not really, you weren't really engaged. It turns out there are ones below that 4/10 of a second too, but no machines were fast enough at the time. There's another one about 2/10 of a second, and there's another one about 1/10 of a second that Walt wasn't able to detect because you just couldn't make machines go that fast then. But we all know how productive we are when the reaction of the computer is instantaneous. Well, he came up with that principle, the economic value of rapid response time. And Joe does a great speech where he talks to the Cardiff team building the Giant, that if they could get the machine to react in less than 4/10 of a second, what he called the Doherty threshold, then people would really love the machine and it would take off. And that is in fact true, and it is what happened. And it was the thing that drove the computer industry, not only in that era, but also in the era of getting to the web, going online and online gaming and things like that. Our thresholds are, much, much faster now than they used to be. But the insight was unique to Walt Doherty, and it really utterly changed the way the industry built machines and software.
And I love that you said that. So one of the questions that I asked when I was deep diving into that episode was 4/10 of a second sounds really fast to me, but also that's back in the 80s that, he's sharing that principle. So it seems like we've gotten to a place where our attention span has decreased over time. So I was curious if that's something that, if we've actually gone to a number lower than the Doherty threshold now.
We have, and the number is really 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second. There doesn't appear to be very much gained much below that. And you can't get much below that. If you're talking about how fast, if you type something into a computer and it goes across the country to a website that's selling you dog food or something and back, that takes about 60 milliseconds. So you really can't get much more than that on average, most of the places in the world, but you can get to that. You can get down to that level. Well, 100 milliseconds, the reason it's an important threshold is, for instance, in the Olympics, when the runners in the 100-meter dash have their feet in the starting blocks, everything is done electronically now. It's not like they used to when they would fire a gun and then they would shoot the gun again if somebody false started. What they do now is the gun is attached to a wire that is connected to all the starting blocks, and you can feel the foot pads can feel the pressure of the runners against the back of the foot pads. And once the gun goes off, and electronically we know exactly when that is now, any change above a certain level in the pressure on the foot pads that happens in less than 100th of a second is an automatic false start and disqualification. And that's because we now know that physiologically human beings can't react in less than 100 milliseconds. So if you can get the computer to operate at whatever it is you're doing at a threshold below 100 milliseconds, you're good as gold. You might as well not go any faster. There was a time in the computer industry when we always talked about the clock speeds on our chip, whether you had a 1 gigahertz chip or a 2 gigahertz chip. Gigahertz means that the computer is doing 1 billion operations per second. But almost nobody talks about that anymore. And the reason they don't talk about it anymore is that we're down below that 100 millisecond threshold for most of the primitive operations on a computer. It doesn't really make that much difference to go any faster, except on gigantic problems now, because human beings can't react any faster than that. But there are those two thresholds, one at about 0.2 of a second and one at about 1/10 of a second, that are faster than the Doherty threshold, that appear to matter.
You raised
The big break, though, is at 0.4 of a second. That's where you really stay connected.
yeah. When you were talking about Joe delivering that information to the team, I think of Joe as a critical character for the show for a lot of reasons, and maybe John Bosworth as well from the standpoint. But when you've got characters who have such a deep technical knowledge, you also need somebody who's going to explain the show and make it accessible to people who don't have that technical knowledge. And I do think this show does a good job of that, because
Yes, I do
obviously
too.
you worked really hard with the technical accuracy, but then you've got a character like Joe who can sort of give it in layman's terms and help us understand the point of the scene that we're watching. So what are some of the things that you might have done, or some of the compromises that were made when you were looking script to script, and making sure that it would be both technically accurate but also easy enough to follow?
Well, there was sort of a two-phase thing that we did when we did those sections of the scripts. When they would produce dialogue to make a point, the first thing I would do, the first pass, I'd go through and get the language right. There are some things that you can say that are right, I guess, in the technical sense, but they're not what computer people say. It's not the way they say it, or they're not the way they pronounce it. So the first thing I did is I went through and I made sure that it was right, and that we would stick in those little phrases that sort of made it pop for anybody who came out of the industry. And Lee Pace spent hours with me over a course of many episodes, and so did Mackenzie Davis, because they wanted to know not just what the words were, because the writers had gotten that right by the time we got the first pass of that, but they wanted to know the way it sounded and what it meant. So they were really trying to understand the way it felt to understand it and to say it, and they both got very good at it. Both Lee and Mackenzie. I mean, of course, Scoop McNairy did it too, but his style of doing it was actually quite different. But Joe and Mackenzie would grill me. Okay, well, would they say it like this, or would they say it like this? Could I pronounce it like this? Well, what if I said it like this? Until they would get it right. And then the second pass would be in conjunction with the writers. We would go, okay, how do we get this concept down to something that we can convey on the screen to somebody who's not necessarily a technical person? And the art of that was something that all good computer salespeople did learn. They don't know how the computer works. They don't know the bits and the bytes. They don't program in machine language or assembly or even Fortran, for that matter, in that era. But they knew how to talk to the customers about what it is that mattered to them. And Joe in particular was very good at that, because that was his role in the show. He was not that he was a technical neophyte by any sense, but he also wasn't Gordon or Mackenzie. Mackenzie, in one of the early episodes, in the scene where Joe meets her, I think it's in a computer programming class, and she makes a remark about the halting theorem. Well, that's a deep Easter egg. I mean, the halting theorem is probably the theorem on which the entire computer industry is based. It was a theorem proved by Alan Turing that was essentially, what can you compute? How do you know that this will do this? And how do you know that when you do it, the computer will halt with an answer? That's why it's called the halting theorem. So there were some very deep things, and Mackenzie was great at getting that right. She wanted to know what it meant. Why is that important, and so forth. And then, I don't know, I mean, actors have a kind of a magic chemistry about them. Once they think they feel the way it's supposed to feel to a technical person, they can make it sing on the screen. And all of the main actors in the show that we've mentioned got to be, I think, supremely good at that. I don't think I've ever seen it done better in any TV show, in any science fiction movie. They just basically had it. You could easily have believed that all of the main characters, the five main characters anyway, that they had actually come out of the industry because of the way they sounded and looked and talked on the shows. But it was two things: technical correctness, and then what did it sound like? Back in the early days of players from the soccer teams in Europe coming in to play professional football, they were brilliant kickers, but they didn't actually, and they kicked that weird side-footed way, which everybody does now. But in the days when that started, I remember there was a funny line from Alex Karras, who was a football player and then later a commentator. He was making jokes about these European soccer players who would say they were going to run in and kick a touchdown, right? Which, of course, what they meant is I'm going to kick the ball through the uprights and score 3 points, but it's not called a touchdown. And we wanted to avoid that first. And then after that, we wanted to make it look right and sound right when they were delivering the line. And that's the thing that actors do uniquely well, that they can channel the character even if they didn't come out of the environment that the characters are based on.
Well said. So were you part of any of the scenes in any particular way?
I actually was, in a way that barely counts. I was in 2 scenes very briefly. Once the flash is so fast, I think it might be a frame or 2. And the other one was, I was in for a long part of the scene, but I'm invisible under the table. But in the scene in the garage where they're doing the probing of the BIOS chip and to reconstruct it, I was actually running the computer under the table. So everything you saw on the screen, I was doing under the table in the garage, and the camera angle was just such that you couldn't see me. But I was literally sitting right there, and I had Lee Pace's knees and Scoot McNairy's knees right next to me under the table while they were working on the computer. And then in the scene where Joe throws the match in the trash can that has the actual source code. Remember, they did the clean room where the people who were working on the reconstruction weren't allowed to see the original code, and the people who had seen the original code weren't allowed to talk to them about it, but they could tell them what it did so they could reproduce it. And the computer industry really operated that way. And you had to put in place really good provisions and protections so that you wouldn't breach that wall. And you had to be able to testify in court if somebody sued you that you had done it, and show what provisions you had made. But at one point, the character Joe McMillan was satisfied that they'd hit the Doherty threshold, and the machine, the giant, was fast enough, and it was going to be a success. Now he was ready to burn the source code. And so he throws the match into the actual source code that they had that said what the thing did. And I'm actually in that scene, and he calls me out by name, by my real name, Carl. He actually points to me and says, Carl. And the camera catches me for just a second. So I'm technically an actor, I guess. And there's a little thing that everybody has heard of it now, because it's called the 6 degrees of separation. You know how separated you are from anybody in the world. Well, that's actually based on a real thing. Most people know it from what's called the Kevin Bacon game, where you say Kevin Bacon has bacon number 0. Anybody who's ever been in a movie or TV show with Kevin Bacon has bacon number 1. Anybody who's been in a movie or a TV show with one of them has bacon number 2. And it turns out that all actors who have a Screen Actors Guild card have a bacon number of 6 or less. It's just the 6 degrees of separation. That really arose from a mathematician, a Hungarian mathematician named Paul Erdős, who for most of his professional life had no home. He was flown around the country by other people to live in people's houses for 2 weeks at a time, or until they couldn't stand him anymore. And he would just work on mathematics with whoever's house he was in. And hundreds and hundreds of mathematicians were involved in it. And so we invented something many years before the 6 degrees of separation theme came around, that was called the Erdős number. And if you were Erdős, you were Erdős number 0. And if you'd ever co-authored a paper with Paul Erdős, and there were 1,500 of them, you have Erdős number 1. And if you had co-authored a paper with somebody who'd co-authored a paper with Erdős, you had Erdős number 2, and so forth. And every professional mathematician has an Erdős number of 6 or less. But I'm one of the very few people in the world who has both an Erdős number and a Bacon number of 2. So it was kind of a fun thing to have, because Toby Huss did a movie with Kevin Bacon. And so I was in that one little scene with Toby, and that means I have a Bacon number.
Look at you. That's so great. One thing that we haven't really talked about, but was a huge part of the show. Obviously, this is a period piece and it's pulling from more than one period, but that also means that the set decoration, the props, they need to match up. And there's got to be a consistency there between what they're putting into the scene from a prop standpoint and what you would really be using. But it couldn't have been easy to get all that tech. So I'm curious, if you know much about the process of how it went from, okay, here's what you've seen in the script to here's what the set dressing looks like.
Right. I know a little. I didn't do it. Boy, that is a job. The people who do that, I guess we just take it for granted when we see movies at a particular period. The people who do that work so hard, and they are so good at it. They often would ask me about things and I describe the way things looked. But of course, memory is a funny thing. So I was never interested. Was that 1986 or was that 1983? And what they would do is they would bring me things they had found online, or they would bring me things that they had bought. They went to like flea markets and online auctions of old computer junk, and they would bring something that'd say, is this it? Does it look like this? And when they couldn't find something that was exactly right, I said, no, that's not the way it looked in 1983. They would build it off of pictures that we could find. And I did do a little bit of research for them to find things and then give it to them. But I tell you, there were a large number of them. They worked very hard and they were very good at it. I don't know how they found that stuff. I did make introductions to them to Gwen Bell at the Boston Computer Museum, and they have a lot of pieces of equipment that are in that museum. And I didn't go with them, but I understand they went to the Boston Computer Museum and they looked at it and they took pictures, and so they knew what things looked like, and they got it pretty right. I mean, I think if you came out of that era, when you saw those episodes unfold, they looked very much like it would have looked in the time that the episode was set. Hard job. Boy, we take it so much for granted. And I think they did the same thing with the costumes, although I'm not a costume expert. I think they got that right too. I mean, the 70s were a forgotten decade, maybe, and 70s and 80s were forgotten decades in the fashion industry. Things looked very different, and so they got all that right too.
And the thing about it is that with all of these details, you might see it on screen for just a moment. Even some of the dialogue that probably made its way in because of what you were in contributing to the show. You could blink and you could miss these moments, right. But if it strikes you as wrong, it sticks with you. So it's like a huge impact and a relatively unsung job, but it's so important.
Exactly. And I know exactly how it feels, because my wife is a doctor, a physician, and she just howls in laughter at all the doctor shows on TV with the utter nonsense that they do on and I don't know, because I'm not a doctor, but I do the same thing when I see anything about a technology subject that is on TV. A very interesting example is Good Will Hunting. Very famous movie, very good movie. I like the movie. But of course, in that movie, there's the famous scene when he's writing stuff on the blackboard and he's supposed to be some kind of a computer genius. Well, anybody who's a mathematician can freeze that shot and know exactly what's on the whiteboard. I mean, that's a freshman class. That's not any advanced mathematics that's on the board. They just put something up that would look appropriately intimidating for people who didn't know in the movie. And does that wreck the movie? No, but believe me, when I saw that in the movie, I noticed it, and it was like, oh, you just roll your eyes, and then you can get back into the movie. But you'd rather not roll your eyes, you'd rather not have that happen. And I regarded that as one of my most important jobs, and I think the writers and Jonathan Lisco and the actors appreciated it, because there were none of those in Halt and Catch Fire, because we didn't let them happen. And I guess I get to be proud of that. We didn't do anything that was like a real clinker.
Absolutely. I mean, that was your job. Take credit for that. I would say, were there any challenges in terms of, I mean, we've talked about how good a job it was that you got the technical accuracy married to the story itself, but were there any particular scenes or episodes that were challenging from that standpoint, where it was a real fight to try to find the way that you'd be able to find that balance?
Yes, and I was responsible for the technical accuracy, but I'll tell you, I wasn't responsible for the writing. The writers did that, but there was a very long discussion, the only really uncomfortable discussion that I had when they wanted, I think the phrase was, they wanted more lights when they were doing the looking at the BIOS with the probes in that first episode in the garage. And I said, guys, you can have all the lights you want. I mean, it's your show, but anybody who came out of that part of the industry will know that it's nonsense. I mean, it's your choice. You can do whatever you want. And they really wanted it to be, more razzle dazzle than that. And I finally worked out with them the way of having them light up a board where they could see the lights. In the real world, that's probably not the way it would have done. It would have been different kind of toggles or something, or it would have been ones and zeros on a screen. But we did a way that was plausibly correct. It would light up the lights for the hexadecimal characters, and then they had their lights. They wanted them to be red and green and yellow but that's not the way it would have happened. And what's interesting is that this is a complete accident, but in 1988 or so, I was the chief executive officer of a supercomputer company named ETA Systems. And the producers of the Die Hard movie came to us and asked if they could use one of our computers in the show, in the movie. And it occurs in the movie in the scene where all the glass shatters on one of the upper floors with the machine gun fight, and the ETA-10, that's called a machine called the Piper, was in the background. And it has a big dome on it on the top. It's a long rectangular black box about 6 feet high, and then it has a glass bubble dome that goes over the top of it. And it has flickering lights that are all different colors. We put those lights in that computer exactly for the movie. The lights do nothing. They respond to something that the computer is doing, but the lights do nothing. But we left it in the computer because it was such an iconic part of it. Well, that's what the producers of the Halt and Catch Fire wanted with the little board, but it wasn't technically accurate. So we sort of tamped it down to something that was real.
Mm. As you told that last story, I'm wondering, in this show, there are companies referenced that don't exist, like Cardiff Electric. There are ones that used to exist and probably didn't anymore. And then there are companies that still existed when this show came out.
Sure.
And I wonder if you know about what the reaction was from any of those companies to the way they were mentioned. I mean, particularly IBM, because they're kind of villainized in the show, but like there are many companies that are referenced. Do you happen to know any of their reactions?
I was no longer at IBM, of course, when that happened. I do know some people from IBM. I think they took it with good grace. And remember that by the time the show came out, IBM wasn't the behemoth in the industry anymore. They were an important company, one of 20 important companies, but they weren't the dominating force that they were in 1981 when the IBM PC came out. I mean, they were everything. And we poked at them a little bit, but we poked at them in a way that anybody who was there knows was real. There's the one scene when they're doing the negotiating of the contract where they have 12 people dressed almost identically in blue suits and white shirts, because nobody ever wore anything other than a blue suit and a white shirt at IBM. I remember Jack Keeler came to work one day in a brown suit, and people thought, oh, the world is that. Nobody wore striped shirts. George Conrades came in 1 week with a yellow tie, and we thought the world had ended, right? They literally did dress like that. That's how we all dressed all the time. And they all carried briefcases. And so there's this scene where the lawyers are coming in and they have 12 lawyers parading into the conference room holding their briefcases. That's real. So if you're going to get offended by that, if you're at IBM, that's kind of foolish, because that's actually the way it looked. I saw that scene in real life, not just in the movie. And I described it to the writers and they reproduced it almost exactly the way I saw it multiple times at IBM. But I don't think they were offended by it in any way. There's very little to be offended by with real history. And because the mashups are all based on something that really happened, it's kind of hard to get bent out of shape over it, right? And IBM actually became slightly easier to contend with over the years between then and when the show came out. They're nowhere near as big as Microsoft or any of the other big players in the industry now. Amazon, Google, Apple, they all eclipsed IBM, even though in some cases, like Microsoft's in particular, they owe their existence to IBM and to the fact that IBM made a mistake in negotiating a contract with IBM.
Mm. Obviously, a lot of the stories that you told the Chris's made it into the show. We've talked about a bunch of them here. Are there any, when you watched the show back, are there any scenes that when you saw how it played out, it surprised you or added a new layer of understanding for you to the real life events that you had seen?
I guess it's kind of a hard question to answer because the writers did such a good job of incorporating them. Nothing like what Joe McMillan did with the Doherty threshold scene actually happened in real life, as far as I know. But he picked up the Doherty threshold theme, which was sort of an undercurrent in the industry, but channeled through Lee Pace's acting, it became a shockingly important component of the story. There's another interesting scene. I had described the connection between Ada Lovelace, the computer language Ada, and Lord Byron. And of course, Cameron Howe was a woman, and so the connection with Ada Lovelace is real. The writers did surprise me with that, because in one episode, I think it's near the end of season 1, when Joe is looking for Cameron, he goes to a motel where they had been, and he asks if she's checked in there, and they say no, and he walks out into the parking lot, and then he stops, and I can still see Lee Pace's face. He turns around and he walks back in and he says, "Is there an Ada Lovelace registered here?" And there was. And so the writers, basically took it a step beyond where I had even suggested the connection between Cameron and Ada, and they literally made her use Ada Lovelace's name in that scene. And now she's not in that scene, but Joe is, and Joe is thinking, who is her hero? As a sort of a counterculture computer savant who's a woman who is channeling Ada Lovelace. And so he went back in, and then I thought that was great writing. And of course, that didn't happen in real life either.
Mm. Who are some of the people that you worked with on this show, or you saw them at work on this show, who perhaps we haven't brought up at other points in this interview, but people that you'd like to acknowledge?
Well, I did work a little bit with Melissa Bernstein, who was the person who probably got the show made. I mean, I think she was betting on the two Chris's, and I think that was a sort of a career risk for her. It turned out brilliantly, I think. She was a power behind the scenes. She's obviously not an actor, and she wasn't a director, but she was, I think, instrumental in giving them the authority to do the show the way they wanted to do it. And now I'm going to embarrass myself here. One of the things I learned about the computer business is there are several people who directed during the course of the 4 years. There were several directors who did multiple episodes, but there were a whole bunch of actual directors. But there was only one first assistant director, and that turns out that's the person who ties the whole show together. And unfortunately, I'm blanking on his name. Hope you can find him and do the interview. He was sort of quietly pulling the strings. And an awful lot of the times I was on the set, half a dozen times for these shows. And he was always there. He was the connective tissue that made the episodes all hang together as a complete series. The sort of, it's the continuity over multiple episodes and multiple seasons.
And that's a tricky thing because, like you said, there are a lot of different directors that come in for something like, yes, there are some that there's one who did 5, there are a couple who did 4. A lot of people came in for one episode to direct the show. So you have to have that consistency in sort of the aesthetic and the tone and how you're shooting it, and how everybody's able to do the jobs that they're meant to be doing. So I love that you reference the first AD as well, and I'm just seeing if I can find that name. And is there anybody else that you wanted to bring up while I'm doing that?
I wish I could remember more of the names of the writers, but they were firing questions at me so fast that I didn't get a chance to learn as much about them as I would have liked to. The person who made it all hang together was Lisco. He was the showrunner for the first 2 seasons, but I think by then the tone was set, and he was everywhere. His vision is what pulled it all together. And I'm sure when I left the room, he was the one who was directing the orchestra as the writers figured out how to use the little bits and pieces that we had talked about. So I think he has an enormous influence on the show.
In terms of first assistant directors, I see a few different names here, but like Warren Gray or Doug Carter, Diane Calhoun.
Unfortunately, I don't remember which one it was, but they're the ones who are sort of under the covers doing a lot of hard work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has been so insightful and informative, and I think it adds a layer for a lot of people to appreciate. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up, something that I didn't ask about? What else should we know about this show?
Well, let me give you a sort of a off the wall version of this. I know that there are a lot of people who wondered whether Gordon Clark was in some way based on Steve Wozniak, because he was sort of paired with Joe McMillan. And there were a lot of people who thought Joe was patterned on Steve Jobs, and therefore Gordon Clark must be patterned on Steve Wozniak. To a certain extent, Joe had elements of Steve Jobs' personality, so that part is right. But Gordon was really based on Gary Kildall. But what's interesting is that I forget what year it was. I don't think the show had completed its run yet, so it might have been in its 3rd or 4th year. But they did a pull together of all of the main cast members and me and Steve Wozniak at South by Southwest in Austin, and we did a bunch of Q&A on it from the audience. One of the interesting things about it was that Steve, of course, he's a terrific guy and technically, extremely good. And he got everything about all the little technology bits and all the little Easter eggs. He got them all. But I think the people who ran the panel at South by Southwest were thinking that he was sort of be the person who was Gordon Clark in the show, which was not true. But there are some similarities between Steve Wozniak and, of course, and the Gordon Clark character. Steve Wozniak was pretty badly treated by Steve Jobs at several points in his career. And of course, the actual person that Gordon was based on, Gary Kildall, got the short end of the stick from Bill Gates. There's nobody in the show, though, who is really patterned after Bill Gates, who in some ways would be, the guy who made the greatest fortune out of the events that were associated with everything that happened in the 4 years of the show, because Microsoft was involved in some way in every one of those things all the way through. But there's no Bill Gates character. And I think that is an interesting insight, because whenever you start talking about the computer industry, you always want to run to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and tell their stories. These writers and these, the two Chris's who wrote the show and the showrunner didn't want that show. They wanted a different show that showed other people. And I think they did it extremely well. And I think it's part of why the show was so successful. It wasn't just another piece about Bill Gates.
Having said that, though, they do nod to Bill Gates. They don't leave him
Sure.
completely out. I know there are a couple scenes. One that comes to mind immediately is there's a scene between Joe Jr. and Joe Sr. No, actually, it's between
Yeah.
Cameron and Joe Sr.
Right.
In Joe Jr.'s apartment. And,
Yep.
Joe Sr. says that he's going to get on a plane tomorrow and he'll be sitting next to Bill Gates, who's going to talk his ear off, and will Cameron just stay and have a drink with them? And so there's a nod
Sure. Of
to him, but it
course.
sounds like he wasn't baked into any of the storylines.
That's right. I mean, there's an old joke in the computer industry in that era. They said, the joke went something like, Microsoft is the ocean, you're going to get wet. So there's no way to write a show about the computer industry in that era without having Bill Gates and Microsoft be some part of the references you talk to. But an awful lot of other interesting stuff happened in the industry at that time, and that's what these guys were picking up. And some of it didn't happen in Silicon Valley, but happened out in Texas, in the Silicon Prairie. And even though they set Cardiff Electric in a different city than Compaq, it's Texas. It's you get all that. So they moved the show away from the natural axis of practically every other show about the computer industry that time, and they found some very interesting stories. And then we picked up all these interesting characters, from the supercomputer designer Seymour Cray to Blackjack Bertram at IBM, and that weren't part of that. So the show became more interesting because the characters had more dimensions than the usual characters we see in the industry.
You just mentioned location, and I feel like that's something we should touch on as we wrap up. This show has really two major focal cities. The first two seasons were
Texas.
set, in Texas, in the Dallas area. The
Right.
last two seasons were more Bay Area, San Francisco. How did that influence what got included? Perhaps the way that the scripts came out, or some of the technical input that you had.
It did have an influence. The computer industry in the early 80s was pretty much the Wild West. I mean, people were making decisions about building these machines that they could never have made 10 years later. In fact, the person who built the IBM PC for IBM, Don Estridge, who died in an airplane crash in Dallas, in the Delta crash of 1983. He was a fairly, not low level, but he was a sort of a middle manager at IBM who was given this PC division. And none of the big IBM executives who ran the heavy iron divisions thought anything of the PC. And they thought they'd sell a certain number and do reasonably well. They thought they'd sell $600 million of them. They wound up selling $9 billion of them. So even that Wild West aspect occurred in IBM. They were down in Boca Raton, Florida. They weren't up in the Hudson Valley where all the other IBM execs were. They had different dress codes. Everything was different. And then when the show moves west, it's really illustrative of the fact that as that industry matured and got into the middle to late 80s and beyond, what took over is the venture capital industry out in the West Coast, in Silicon Valley, around Sand Hill Road and so forth. And of course, some of the main characters in the show go into that industry, and Carrie herself goes into, Carrie Bechet's character, Donna, goes into the venture capital business. And one of the things I didn't mention of this is that during the time I was actually the technical consultant for the show, I was the managing director of a venture capital firm that was, on the West Coast. So it did change the behavior of the industry. A whole different group of people came in. It became much slicker. There was a much faster timeline for getting to profitability. You see that in seasons 3 and 4 as they go through the things they're trying to do on the web and so forth. So the tone of the show changes because the tone of the industry changed over that 10 years, as it went from being, who are these upstarts who are creating this brand new part of the computer industry that literally ate the dinosaur from below. While IBM was saddling the dinosaur, the mammals were eating the feet, and then it went out to the West Coast, and the dinosaur riders at least regained control of the industry. The dinosaurs were gone, but the people who financed them were the ones who became increasingly important in the industry. And that actually is what happened. And it's indicative of a theme that goes even beyond the computer industry. There was a time when most of the innovative research in technology in the United States occurred either in universities or in the big research arms of companies like IBM and AT&T and others. When it became too economically risky to do that, what happened is the venture capital industry became the risk engine of the technology industry. And the mantra became, go ahead and fail if you have to, but fail fast. Don't waste a lot of my money before you fail, because we have to keep trying it until we get something that works. And that's one of the most important driving themes of seasons 3 and 4, with the new businesses that they start, that Cameron and Carrier are involved in. That I'm confusing the actors and the parts out, like Donna and Cameron.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, what are you up to now? Is there anything we should know about what's going on in your world?
Well, I'm a technologist at heart. So I spent years in the venture capital business and, did very well. And when it came time to not do that anymore, I wanted to go back to doing what I love the most. And what I love the most is making computers go fast. And so now we have a whole bunch of much faster computers. There are marvelous things. If you were doing another Halt and Catch Fire for a different generation in the industry, I think you would write the show that was a mashup of what happened with the company NVIDIA, which originally made the little chips that were behind the monitors on computer screens that made the graphics work on your screen, so that the CPU didn't have to do all the calculations for where to put the red dot and where to put the blue dot and where to put the yellow ray on the screen. And over time, that has evolved so that they are probably the most important computer company in the world right now. And they very recently became only the 6th company in the history of the world to reach $1 trillion market cap. So my little company, which is called Simple Rose, uses those machines, and we try to make certain kinds of mathematical problems that are very complex, very large and very complex. We think billions are small nowadays. Now we think billions of billions are about the size of things we need to work with. And we use that new Wild West, the new frontier of these extremely fast computer chips, that what are called GPUs, to do calculations that would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago. And so I always like to be right at the edge of where things are happening. And for most of my career, I've been able to stay just in front of the crest of the wave, and that's a fun place to ride. So I'm doing it again.
Wow. Well, Carl, thank you so much for taking all this time to talk with us. I mean, the information that you've shared, I think, is gratifying probably to people within your industry. And for those of us who aren't in the industry, it gives a lot of new information to the show for us to enjoy, and just to realize that how many layers of details there were to make this show what it was. So thank you for being so generous with your time and your thoughts.
Well, I appreciate it, Melissa. I think it's a wonderful show, partly because of the technology things that are in it, but also because this group of actors did such a marvelous job, and writers and directors and everybody, they did such a marvelous job of making an interesting show out of it as well, based on all these facts. The show is more than the technology that's in it, and that's why it works. What we know, if we came up in this industry, is that it's full of people who were quirky and interesting and entertaining and weird. And it's that weirdness that makes the industry so engaging, and the actors caught it. I've watched their careers since they did this show, and they've all gone on to do marvelous things since then as well. And I'm not at all surprised. So this has been a lot of fun. I'm glad the show is getting a second, third, fourth look, because I think it is one of the great sleepers of the era when it came out, and it's one of probably the best technology show I've ever seen. So it's great. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being here. And to everybody who's watching this, go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Bye, everyone.
Great show. Bye.